Hi, Buck.
Hi. Hi, Karen.
Good to see you again. It's been a year, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, it's been over half a year now since I moved out of California. So,
Okay. Well, we're here today so that we can talk about Bitcoin. But before we get started on Bitcoin, I thought it might be interesting to anybody who's watching to know a little bit about your background and how you got to Bitcoin and anything that you want to tell us would be
sure.
great.
Um, yeah, so I grew up in New York City, but haven't lived there for a while now, over a decade. Ended up going to college in Toronto, basically because it was cheaper, and studied economics and Chinese language there, and
Wow.
which is kind of how I ended up getting to Bitcoin in a roundabout way. But so during college, I did a semester abroad and in China to study the language. And then after I graduated, I went back. I was only planning to go for just a summer, just to improve my language skills a little bit, maybe teach English. I ended up um, getting an internship that turned into they gave me a full-time offer, which brought me back, and ended up meeting my future wife there. And so, things kind of turned.
Meeting her in China, you mean?
Yeah, we met in China. She's from the UK originally, my wife Amy, but she's part Chinese. She had family there. Actually, the internship was at her family's company, which is how we met.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, 3 months turned into 6 years, and it was after China I moved back to the States and got into. I had been doing some freelance web development in China, among other things, but kind of wanted to speed up the development there, and did a coding boot camp and became a full-time software engineer, and lived in the Bay Area for a few years, and felt the need to kind of get out, and so that brought me here. And the story with Bitcoin was actually I kind of came at it more from the economic side than from the engineering side, just because that had been my sort of formal economic background. I was just getting into the tech side of things, but the sort of the economic principles that were underneath Bitcoin just seemed totally revolutionary to me, and kind of drew me into that rabbit hole. And what was interesting is actually living in China, and I was freelancing at the time when I first learned about Bitcoin. Um, Freelancing, you can be your income is not super liquid. You basically get paid in chunks. So you have a contract, and then you have stages, and you don't get paid until certain stages are done. And then I'd have clients that were back in the U.S. or in China, or even like other countries like Australia, and so getting paid or having access to the cash wasn't always as easy as one might think. Especially in China, it's not as simple as a money transfer, which you can do between more friendly countries like the UK or Canada or the US. And so I discovered Bitcoin as a way to actually send money to myself. If I got paid into my US account. Actually, the first thing I did when I had heard about it was like, okay, before I try anything else, I'm going to see if I can send myself $1 from my US accounts to China. And I was able to do that. And even sending $1 like that, just the fact, sending $1 is not very easy to do in US dollars, but you can do that in something like Bitcoin. And so that really hammered home to me just the importance of the technology. And so it was kind of cool having
What year was that?
2014.
Okay.
So depending on your perspective, early days, but I've met people that have been in it for far longer. And so,
Mhm.
yeah.
So how involved are you with Bitcoin? You just use it, or you
I mean,
trade with
originally it was just using it, and then for the past couple years, I've my last two jobs now have been directly in the cryptocurrency space. So I've worked in my previous company. They paid our salary was actually paid in Bitcoin,
it?
um,
Wow.
and both jobs have given me the opportunity to kind of work and contribute to open source projects that. Um, that do contribute to the Bitcoin ecosystem. So I've been able to actually be working in the code and understanding how it works, and programming smart contracts and interacting with them as well, and that type of stuff.
So that's what you're doing now. You're in Texas, am I right?
I'm in Texas. The company I work for is still in San Francisco, but
yeah. Okay. Well, before we go on and explore Bitcoin a little bit more, seems to me I remember that you did something kind of extraordinary when you were in China. Talk about that at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so like I said, I was living in China for 6 years. About halfway through that time, I was spending a lot of my time we lived in Beijing, and that's where we spent most of our time, maybe traveling a little bit for holidays. But Beijing is pretty cosmopolitan, and we had a lot of expat foreign friends, and so we kind of my wife and I felt like we weren't really getting to experience much of China. And at that point, I'd been motorcycling for a few years. My dad motorcycled, and I'd done some trips around the U.S. and so we kind of came to the decision. We'd done some smaller trips around China too, just near Beijing, and so we ended up deciding to motorcycle across the whole country of China. And that ended up being about 5 months. We originally planned for 4 months, and that trip broke a Guinness World Record, but that record has since been broken, which is at the time the longest continuous motorcycle journey within a single country. That our total distance was 38,000 kilometers, about 21,000 miles. But what I think we still did that was unique was we went through every province. So part of the goal was to see as much of China as we could, and China is such a big and diverse country. I think we get a certain perspective of it from the news about being this kind of like, homogenous blob of factories and bicycles and cars, but it's got such long history and a lot of diversity, and so we kind of wanted to visit as much of that as possible. And so we came up with an itinerary that took us through every province, and I ended up writing a book about it. So the name of the trip and the book was The Great Ride of China. So if anybody wanted to learn more of that, and put up some videos and stuff too. But yeah, it was a great opportunity to just learn more about China. Definitely my wife and I, at that time, we were just still dating, got to know each other a lot better. Yeah, but it was fun.
So will there be links available to the videos that you could send me so that we can put them on
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So what would you say was your big takeaway from that trip across China?
I don't know. I mean, there was a lot of little ones. One kind of superficial thing was just we worked with a charity to help raise money for school lunches in the country. So this charity, Free Lunch for Children, that would provide school lunches to schools in rural areas around the country, and then also worked with some sponsors. And so just on a superficial level, is really interesting working on that kind of business side. I think charities and fundraising are quite new in the country, and so that was interesting to learn about. I had done kind of long distance trips like that before. I was a big long distance hiker when I was younger as well, and so I'd done the Appalachian Trail after high school, and so I'd spent some time going through those types of experiences. But it was interesting doing that in a different country, and I think one of the things I appreciate about being in China is, kind of just how much just people have in common with each other. A lot of the ways we behave and react in both positive and negative ways are pretty universal. They're universal truths about what makes us operate, what makes us operate in relation to each other and other people. And so being in a country that's as different as China is from the US and finding those similarities, I think was important, and it's nice to experience that. And we need to have more sympathy for stuff like that, even within the US. I mean, trips around the US, and you find both how different and how similar we are between New York and California and Texas and Georgia and everything in between.
Yeah, that. In a second, that's going to bring me to a quote from the article that you wrote about Bitcoin. But first, I'd like to ask, you said that you took a trip around Appalachia. Did you ever read the book Walk Across America?
I did
It's
not.
an
No.
old book. I think it's 1980s something. It was a book that I read that had a great impact on me, and it was a guy like you who decided that he was going to walk across America. And so he started in the Appalachians and walked through the Appalachians, and then I think he ended up going down the southern route through New Orleans, because that's where he met his future wife.
Right.
While he was on the walk. And then he and she together continued the walk all the way out to the West Coast.
Wow.
And he had the same takeaway that you did, that he met so many people, diverse people in every income level and every background, every conceivable background, and he just met so many wonderful people, and obviously there was the bad along with the good. But
yeah, another book like that was Travels with Charlie. I think that's Steinbeck. I tried to read a lot of these different types of books, or like travel experience ones, when I was writing my own book, and see how it was done. And that was one. And that was similar, there was still segregation in the South, so traveling through that area, and like you said, the good and the bad. And also Mark Twain's book, I think that's On the Road. And it's incredible to read somebody that's doing the same thing, but back in the 1800s. And, he's traveling through Utah when Mormonism is basically just getting established, and, kind of sets himself up in a gold mining settlement in the Southwest, and makes his way up to San Francisco, even gets out to Hawaii. It's crazy. It's wild.
So you've had quite a life for somebody as young as you are.
I guess. That's Mark Twain, but yeah.
I know that was Mark Twain, but I'm just saying that all the things that you've done already, it's very interesting. So I want to go back to this article that you wrote about Bitcoin. There's a couple of quotes that I pulled from it that I thought were pretty interesting, and I'll put a link to the article so people can get at it. That you were discussing, you made the comment that incredible research is taking place to explore more efficient rule enforcement mechanisms. And you use such as proof of stake versus Bitcoin's proof of work. Which I don't know anything about that, but you went on to say, but even these spend more time discussing how to more efficiently punish bad actors than the mechanisms that decide what constitutes a bad actor in the first place. And I thought that was a really interesting contrast there, and I wondered if you could discuss that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of that article, it ended up being quite long, and what drove me to want to write it in the first place was I had spent some time, as the background was, after the 2016 election, and actually at the same time, obviously there was all the drama around the 2016 election and a lot of just animosity and frankly uninteresting politics in a lot of ways. And Bitcoin at the same time was actually going through its own kind of political turmoil. It sounds quite random, but this idea of block space, but I think it came down to an argument of governance as well. And so I was just kind of exhausted from it. I took a break, but in the interim, taking a break from modern politics and Twitter and all this sort of stuff, I decided to spend some time reading some of our own history, which made me, as I spent time doing that, realizing how little I had actually been taught about our own history. And one of the things that I found fascinating was how much time was spent in the creation of the U.S. Constitutional system, not in like, here are the things that should be done that are right, but more just creating a system that anticipates we'll have the wrong people in charge, and how to kind of govern our worst impulses. And what I found as I learned more about Bitcoin and learned about the US is that there was something unique in that there had never been something created before, except for maybe the Magna Carta, which isn't even it laid out some principles, but it wasn't actually a governing document. But both the U.S. Constitution, Magna Carta, in part, and then Bitcoin, I found, kind of decided like, okay, well, we can never ensure that the right people will be in charge, whether that's in governments, in the federal government, the state level government, or, in the case of Bitcoin, the right people will be mining Bitcoin or the right people will be owning Bitcoin. So all the best we can do is try and govern our worst impulses. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at, is so many people focus, you kind of have this, this idea of, I don't know if this probably isn't original to me, but this idea of the tyranny of the experts. And you have this tendency of people that know a lot to believe that if only they're in charge, or if things can be applied in the way that they believe they should be, then everything would be all right. And I just find it so incredible that in the US system, and again in Bitcoin, you had, I think it's something like 5 of the founding fathers that ended up becoming president, and yet they created a system that controlled their power, the power that they would eventually yield. And nobody else has done that. You always try and maximize, well, as long as I can get done what I need to get done. And I think when I try and evaluate crypto projects or policies or politicians or people that I admire, I kind of want to find the people that have a sense of their own, or policies or whatever, that have a sense of their own fallibility, essentially, because I know there's a humility there, and I think it ultimately, interestingly enough, if you look over the course of a very long period of time, the ability to stop our own worst impulses is far more valuable than trying to get the right things done.
Yeah, that ties in. It makes me think about so many different things. So I did an interview last week with Lydia Ortega, who was the chair of the economics department at San Jose State for a number of years. And now she's living in Texas as well, in Dallas. She's retired. And she was talking about that modern economics, or at least economics as she studied it and got her doctorate in, is based on the idea of human greed, that the free market protects us against human greed because it takes that as a given. Mm-hmm. And would you say that was also the basis of what you learned when you studied economics?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's about studying incentive mechanisms, and that humans operate on incentives. I think even it's interesting because I don't know if you've heard of Dan. I think Dan Ariely. He did. He's a behavioral economist. He wrote a book. I'm trying to remember it now. Was it Irrationally? I forget. Anyway. But even when humans behave irrationally, we're still reacting to incentives, whether those are, evolutionarily based or rationally based. And yeah, I mean, I think,
would it be like what Adam Smith called enlightened self-interest, or?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's someone else I follow a lot. The EconTalk podcast, which is great. He talks a lot about kind of that dual side of Adam Smith. And I think we actually lose sight of that in modern economics. There's, his most famous book, The Wealth of Nations, talks about the invisible hand, but then he also has his other work about the quote that he always gives is like, man desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. So that there are these other incentives that operate, and that operates in the market as well. And that is something that I think is probably missed out on when they're teaching economics, or I haven't gone to business school myself, but in a lot of modern business schools and the writings that come out of them and the people that come out of them, kind of just optimizing based off of that greed, which I think sometimes we go too far in the opposite direction to say, no, that's not right. That's not how we work, because we do work that way in a lot of ways, but you have to apply these other things. And you can be greedy about your own happiness too, right? Like greed can also be, yeah, I'm going to sacrifice my work time to spend time with my family. You're being greedy about your happiness. And that's, I don't see those two things in conflict. It's just a lot harder to model them. You can't put that on a graph as easily.
Well, yeah, and I guess the thing that I think about is that in a lot of ways, greed protects us from greed.
Yeah.
My own self-interest protects me from the self-interest of somebody else, because I'm only going to pay as much for a product as I feel I want to pay for it. And so the other guy may want to get a lot more money for it so that he can make more money, but he can only get as much as I'm willing to pay. So,
which is exactly what the James Madison in particular figured out with his idea behind the extended republic, is that there's always going to be special interests, and you can try and, like, in our attempts to try and get rid of special interests, all we do is give more power to a different set of special interests. And what again was so fascinating with the especially in the Federalist Papers, where they really outline this, is what in Federalist 10 in particular, James Madison talks about the power of faction, and it's unavoidable. And that's the same thing with greed. Rather than trying to control greed or trying to control faction, you have to create a system where the different factions balance each other out. And that's exactly what the free market is that, different special interests are going to compete. And the best we can do is allow them to compete within a structure of morals, which is also why the founding fathers, stressed the importance of, the system only works with immoral, good people. I think that was John Adams that said that. And so I think it's a little bit of both.
Well, so given that the free market is the best way to control our natural impulses, how would you say we could get back to actually having a free market in this country? Or maybe that's too tough a question. Here's a more specific question. I sometimes look at what happens when some of the players get on top and start making bank at the expense of people. I know that there's a lot of discussion about, a lot of anger towards certain groups of companies, especially like pharmaceuticals, which I think part of that is that people don't really understand the kind of cost that goes into research and development, and that has to be remade, regotten. But at the same time, there are players in that space that go way above and beyond in charging. And I've often wondered, is that because somehow they've gotten in bed with the government, and so they're getting some perks on one side out of this faction system, and it's not really a free market anymore? Or do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is, I've heard it described as, complexity is a subsidy, or the more complex.
That's a great quote.
Yeah. I really love that, because it happens in so many aspects of our lives where, there's a reason why Facebook is lobbying for them to be regulated. And it's because as soon as they know what to expect. And it's a lot easier for them to manage the regulations than it is for a newcomer, right? So, when the GDPR regulation came through in Europe, it's one thing for Facebook or Google to have these trainings, but, when my company, which had 5-6 people that were going to sit down, we had to go through an hour-long training about this stuff that really didn't apply to what we were doing. And when you're a small company, an hour of 6 engineers' time is pretty expensive. And it's a bigger chunk of our company's value than it is for Facebook's. And that creates these kind of embedded interests. And not only that, but I remember my mom owned a restaurant in New York City for 35 years. And I remember when the Affordable Care Act first came out, there was something like 140 companies that were able to get these waivers for some of the employment rules. Now, what all those companies had in common were they were giants. But if you were a company that had 50 people, that's still a very small company. That doesn't even qualify under the SME numbers as small and medium enterprises, that, the official measure that's small and medium by our government, 50 people, and you start to fall under the rules that these giant companies got waivers for. So, yeah, I mean, I think the best we can do to try, I think one of the important things we need to do, I think that we have a problem on all sides of the political aisle. And actually what was so fascinating that led me to write that article on cryptocurrency governance was that a lot of the same patterns I was seeing, in the political debates around the 2016 election were happening and were mirroring themselves in the Bitcoin world. And you have all of these, anarcho-capitalists and libertarians that are saying, oh, I've given up on the political world because they're all dumb and making dumb arguments, saying the same thing when they're making arguments about Bitcoin, blaming evil corporations and, this guy is evil, this guy wants to destroy everything we believe in. And it's just like, how are you making these, and the fact that the parallels, it just always repeats. And I think one thing that I kind of like to see and that I really respected about what they had in the Federalist Papers is it's not about this person is evil or this person wants to destroy your way of life. It's just we're all acting in our own perceived best interests. And you can't start a conversation by saying that the person that disagrees with you because they're evil. And I think the same thing goes with the pharmaceuticals. Like, pharmaceutical companies are behaving according to the incentive structures that we have put into place. And they're going to make bad decisions, but they're just going to make the decisions that they view as best. The best thing that we can do is create the environment that allows us as a market and a society to correct. Just something as simple as just information can help make those decisions a lot more. And the problem is I think humans, we have a utopian tendency. We want things to be perfected, but humans are not perfect, so we can never be perfected. So, and when you want things to be perfected, the most efficient way to perfect things is to have one person or one set of group of people in charge. So you see the pharmaceuticals doing something wrong when they're just behaving like humans, and you say, well, they're evil. What we need to do is put a different group of people in charge that will punish these evil people. You're just going to get the same problem.
Yes, well, you get the same problem. Now you've got it at every level, all the way down.
Exactly, and it becomes harder to correct as well. It's a lot harder to correct a government than it is to correct a business.
Right, which is why we'd love to get back to where we're much more locally controlled on everything.
Yeah, because local governments have a lot more accountability.
I thought your insight on the polarization in the sphere of politics shows up again in Bitcoin, and it made me think about all the teaching that Jordan Peterson has been doing about people getting trapped in their ideologies. I'm not sure what's the best way to say that. That because the world has become such a complex place, people are looking for some little box that they can fit in, and once they can fit inside that box and have all the rules that make them feel safer inside that box, then they live in that box, they speak out of that box, but that it tends to end up at the fringes, out on the outskirts, these ideologies. And I actually had to take a look at myself and think, how much of what I'm saying and thinking is actually coming from my own thinking process and my own deciding to learn more about various viewpoints, and how much of it is coming out of what I considered, because I considered myself a conservative, and I thought that built a beautiful picture for me of how the world works. And I still do think, like you do, that the Constitution is this amazing document that is protecting us from our worst impulses and all of those things. But I also decided I don't want to be trapped in an ideology.
Yeah.
I want to be focused on speaking truth, learning truth, seeking truth. And so have you listened to Jordan Peterson at all? Have you
I spent some time listening to, his interviews and,
well, his interviews are not representative of what he's teaching, because the interviews almost always end up being contentious because somebody is in opposition to.
Well, some of his more friendly interviews, so like Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro, I find those more interesting. The contentious ones are entertaining, but less informative.
But his real body of work that I see is from Maps of Meaning, which is a very long, very complicated, difficult book, but it has a lot of amazing insights in it on this whole arena. And I love your complexity is a subsidy.
Yeah. I think I got that from Jonah Goldberg, but he might have gotten it from somewhere else as well. One of the things too, and I think Jordan Peterson talks about this, and Ben Shapiro does as well, but it is one of the problems that we're having now is that as our world becomes more secular, humans just like to search for meaning and belonging anywhere they can. And so one of the things that we're doing is, rather than finding it in a place that can involve different people of different backgrounds and different viewpoints. You have one unifying thing, whether it's, believing in Jesus Christ or the Hebrew Bible or, Muhammad or whatever. But within that, it can encompass a lot more. And we're losing that. And we search for meaning and identity amongst different types of groups. And I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with ideology, because I think ideologies present us with frameworks for how we can view and not just view, but analyze new situations. So based off of a certain ideology, like I, and it sounds like you as well, believe in kind of limiting principles and protecting, individual sovereignty and all these nice, good things that we've believed in the United States for a long time now. You can use that as a basis to evaluate other ideas. And I think one of the problems that we fall into is that we become more we identify our ideologies more with our tribe, essentially, than with the kind of foundations of these in the first place. I've always found it quite reassuring, at least in conservative circles, that you have these. It's become a smaller circle of even just conservatives these days, but arguments and debates within those circles about, well, we agree on this ideology. Now, how does that ideology apply to this and that situation? Whether or not it's support of Trump or it's, how to deal with, bakeries in Colorado and these types of things. And I think those debates are interesting because it's like, well, we have this ideology. Now, how does this apply to this situation? Doesn't mean we'll always agree, but it creates a framework for how to decide those things. And I think deciding those things is important. Mm-hmm. And if we're not thinking about those within a framework that we can all agree on, then you're going to make these decisions based off of your tribe and your faction, really. But really, it's not even a faction anymore. It really is just tribe. Like it's identity politics. Is I identify with this group and this group says that this is wrong. I don't care why they say it's wrong, but they're in my group, so I have to support what they say.
So I think it's just a semantic thing because when you say ideology in that framework, I'm thinking more of like principles. Yeah. We have a set of principles by which we kind of analyze what's happening in the world, which that's different from just being part of a tribe, identity politics. And I think when Peterson uses the term ideology, he's talking about people who have oversimplified their framework. So they're no longer understanding any deep principles that underlie that framework. It's just simply a package deal for them that allows them to have an identity. And as you said, it becomes their tribe, it becomes their source of meaning and all of that.
Yeah, and I think when you drill down into people like that, if you ask, what is your ideology? What principles do you believe in? There's nothing there. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, again, there's no limiting principle. You can drill down. It's like, well, why do you think that baker should be punished? So, okay, well, should a baker that refuses to bake a cake for, a Jewish baker that refuses to bake a Nazi cake, should he be forced to do that too? And, it's like, if it doesn't there's no unifying principle there. There's really no ideology. It's really just based off of, there's no principle. It's based off of who you identify with, which is.
Well, and it all goes to emotion, right?
Yeah, it's entirely emotional. And, that's the road to serfdom, the road to tyranny.
That's another good book I should put in. Yeah. And I just lost my thought, but anyway, was there anything that you wanted to talk about in terms of Bitcoin that we haven't covered yet?
No, I'm not sure. It's such a broad space. I think it's a good time to be talking about Bitcoin, just as, the first time ever a president or world leader has tweeted about it, which is interesting. He tweeted the wrong things about it, I think, but he's bringing it into the consciousness. And I guess one thing, it always depends on the familiarity of the audience, but one of the questions I've gotten a lot recently is this idea of Libra, Facebook's cryptocurrency coin that they're coming out with, and what that means for Bitcoin. And I think one of the interesting things about Libra coming into the conversation is I think it really highlights how unique in history Bitcoin actually was. And if anything, Libra presents a greater threat to the fiat currencies than it does to the cryptocurrencies, because there's nobody that you can call up to Congress to testify about what policies will or will not be in place in Bitcoin, but you can do that for Libra. And if you look at how they're structuring their governance system, the transaction auditing, all these types of things, everything that they're using in Libra is technology that's at least 20 years old. So it's nothing entirely new.
So do you think that this is going to be one of those situations where if Libra comes under the government umbrella and becomes regulated, that's going to negatively impact Bitcoin's ability to operate?
No, not at all. I think, Libra will almost by necessity end up coming under the umbrella of governments. One of the reasons why people think that Bitcoin came out of thin air, but there had been decades of research and attempts to create a digital currency. And one of the problems that they weren't able to solve until Bitcoin was it would always have to be managed essentially by a third party. There was there was one attempt that was called BitGold, and you basically had an organization that would store gold that would be backed by this cryptocurrency, which is literally exactly what Libra is. It's like, no, we're able to keep a stable value because we hold all of these government bonds and securities. But the problem with that is that then there's something that can be gone after. And governments don't want that type of competition because that makes a competing governance system to their own, and that's monetary policy is a major lever that governments use, and that's what we used to have the ability for banks, like private banks, to issue their own currencies, deposit certificates essentially, but they could be spent. And Hayek has a great essay. I think it's the free competition of money, which actually it kind of describes a world of cryptocurrencies now that we have all these different currencies that are being issued, and they're going to compete with each other. But when you move to fiat, you can't have that competition anymore. And gold gave us an opportunity to have a sort of a depoliticized money supply, and that went away. I think there are some very good technical reasons why we can't do it. It's expensive and hard to move and store and validate. But now Bitcoin gives us a lot of the benefits without the downsides of gold, and it can't be gone after. So you see these patterns of, in ancient Rome, when the empire was essentially starting to lose their influence, they were inflating their money supply. They would scrape, you can see this in old coins, they would scrape off the edges of their coins and take the shavings and melt them down and try and create new ones, but say the old ones still had the same value. And that's not something you can do with Bitcoin. That is what governments do when they when they've lost the faith of the people that they govern, essentially, because they can't, if they can't ask us for more money, it's because we don't trust them anymore. And so they have to find a new way to get money.
Well, so I'm going to ask a really dumb question.
No dumb questions.
But the question that occurs to me is that if it comes to that where the digital currencies come under, well, at least something like Libra comes under the government umbrella, wouldn't there be a potential for the government then to say, okay, Bitcoin and other digital currencies are illegal, and if you use them, you're subject to the full force of the law?
Sure, but the thing is you can do that and you can enforce it with Libra because they're controlled by centralized entities. Mm-hmm. But you cannot do that with Bitcoin. So they can make it much more difficult to interact with. But to put it this way, if the government wanted to make Libra illegal, all they have to do is go after Facebook and say, you have to hand over these resources that you're using to back the currency. And as soon as they do that, or even if there's a hint of their threat of that happening, the value of Libra goes down because you can no longer trust the assets that back the currency. There's actually no asset that backs Bitcoin as a currency other than the hash power and the holders that already own it. So you saw the same thing with gold before. The US government has confiscated gold from its citizens before. FDR did it when they were starting to move away from the gold standard, and they needed control over the money. They needed more control over the money supply for their various efforts at staving off a double dip of the Great not the Great Recession, the Great Depression. But the problem. So here's the thing. Okay, if they want to do that with Bitcoin, there's no asset backing it that they can go after. So the value itself, one Bitcoin is still worth one Bitcoin. One Libra is promised to not be worth one Libra. It's promised to be the equivalent of one share of these assets that they hold. So they confiscate that from Libra, the value of that Libra goes down. My one Bitcoin still is worth one Bitcoin. Now, they can make it very difficult to purchase by basically shutting down Coinbase and Gemini or whatever, these exchanges where you can purchase it. But if I wanted to contract you or you wanted to contract me for something and I wanted to pay you in Bitcoin, I'll do it. So
it'd be like the old barter system.
It wouldn't even be. It would be a little bit more like what you have. You have these US dollar black markets in a lot of countries that have deflating currencies, right? Or inflating currencies, sorry. So Venezuela, Argentina in the past, Zimbabwe. What they do is they make it illegal to buy, sell, or transact in US dollars because it undermines their currency and quickens the devaluation of their currency by people basically opting out. But what ends up happening is a black market is created because nobody wants to hold the local currency, so they get their hands on US dollars one way or another. And then people voluntarily transact in those. A barter system is a little different because in a barter system, you're trying to transact in one unit for another, like trying to make equivalence. Whereas this is still a currency system because we just have to have new price discovery mechanisms. So if you can still price in US dollars and find markets and find exchanges, because even if governments went after it, you can still publish websites and put them up on Tor and all those types of things. So what ends up happening, I think, one of the most bullish things that could happen for Bitcoin is if governments start to come after it, because if they're coming after it, it means they're in trouble. And if they're in trouble, it means you probably don't want to hold as much US dollars anymore. If you don't want to hold as much US dollars anymore, you're going to have to find an equivalent. And I think that equivalent is going to be Bitcoin. It means more people are going to want to hold Bitcoin. And that just, more people that want something and with the same amount of supply means that the value goes up. So
that's what our signal is going to be then. It's always good to know.
Yeah. Every time they want to raise the debt ceiling, just buy a little bit more Bitcoin.
Yeah. So do you have any questions for me?
Oh, well, how's it going starting the podcast? I guess it's been a couple weeks now, or the video series.
Yeah, I think I could turn these into podcasts because I have all the audios, obviously, from the Zoom thing. I just haven't looked into how to get that done yet. I am not very technical, and I have a 25-year-old daughter who is, and so
Sure.
she got me set up here, but she just started a new career 2 weeks ago, so she does
Busy.
not have time to
Yeah.
be messing around with this stuff. Yeah. So it has been an extraordinary experience because I've met some really fascinating people doing this, and I don't have much viewership yet, but I noticed that recently the views have started upping, and I am assuming that once people start getting interested that they'll go back and watch the original ones, because some of the early ones are, I think, very important ideas were being discussed, which was very exciting. And I'm very interested in many different arenas, and I got interested in economics years ago when I was a state representative in Iowa in the early 80s. And at that time, that was in the Reagan wave. So I got invited to Washington, D.C. with the young conservative faction of all state legislators across the United States, and got an opportunity to kind of get on the inside of some things, which was very fascinating. And through that, I got a scholarship to attend a Foundation for Economic Education week-long seminar in upstate New York. And that taught me Austrian economics, and I just fell in love, and then was a fan of Hayek and von Mises and all those guys. And I did as much study as I could on my own. I mean, I never had the time to actually go and take a degree or anything, but it's always been a fascination for me. So I knew that you were involved in Bitcoin, and I knew that you were involved in programming, but I didn't know you were an econ guy.
Yeah.
So this has been just a treasure to have this opportunity to talk with you. And the big question in my mind is, when are you going to run for office? We need people like you. I mean, there's just no question.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. Well, I mean, it's just so depressing watching everybody that is in politics and what they have to go through. And
yes, well, that's the thing, isn't it? We've come to a place in our nation where good people just have absolutely no incentive to put themselves through that. And good people are making their own living and making their own way and making a difference in the world that way. So maybe politics isn't the place to make a difference anymore.
yeah, I mean, the problem, the thing I've been thinking about very recently actually is, I know a lot of people, especially in tech and even in crypto, that, are like, oh, I don't care about politics. It's all dumb. It's all, people fighting about petty tribal differences. But, the problem is, and, you can certainly ask a Venezuelan or Hong Konger about this. It doesn't matter how little you care about politics, but politics will always care about you.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to always concern ourselves with the nitty gritty, but it'd be nice if people start caring a little bit more about these first principles, because we can always change policies and change parties and all this sort of stuff, but if you don't care about the sovereignty of the individual and freedom to make choices for yourself and for the freedom for other people to make wrong decisions for themselves, then again it'll eventually catch up with you. So I don't know. For now, I just spend time. I'm a young conservative that grew up in New York City, went to school in Toronto, and lived in California and as an expat. So I've always kind of lived amongst people, and all of my closest friends basically all disagree with me. And so you spend a lot of time thinking about the ideas and, hopefully making a little bit of a difference in people's opinions of these opinions.
Well, I'm just going to leave you with a quote from Paul Vanderklay. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he is a pastor in Sacramento.
I think you sent me the interview you did with him.
Yeah. So he has somehow become a hub for all sorts of people who are interested in this problem of how do we get back to individual sovereignty and meaning. And he's also been discussing John Vervaeke's series on meaning, which is really a fascinating series, looking at first principles going all the way back to the Greeks and Romans, and what we've lost through our education system of not teaching about these things anymore. But anyway, this quote from Paul Vanderklay I thought was so interesting. Somebody asked him, well, what is reality? And he said, well, I've been thinking a lot about that lately. And he said, I think reality is that which governs.
Yeah.
And I thought about that in the context of what you said with, somebody in Venezuela. As much as you can say politics isn't important, sooner or later you come face to face with the consequences of reality, because it requires you to pay attention, right?
Yeah. And I think, that miniseries that HBO did recently on Chernobyl, I think really highlights that is, these ideas of utopia or trying to perfect things, or, it'll eventually catch up, and it can catch up in really disastrous ways. And I think we need to be okay with the small problems, the small evils, the small mistakes, to avoid the really large ones. So to go back to the pharmaceutical thing, okay, well, companies and people are going to make mistakes, but if we try and control it all, like the consequences can be so much broader and more devastating. Just from trying to fix things. It's not even like people trying to fix it are evil. Like a lot of the people in Chernobyl, it's not that they were evil and wanted that thing to blow up. It's just they just got caught up in the wrong incentives, essentially.
Well, and I didn't see that series, but one quote that I heard from it kind of brought it all down to where the problem really began, was that people stopped telling the truth.
And they were incentivized to stop telling the truth. That's what it was. And I think what's so fascinating about that is, I studied Chinese language and society, and then I did a course in the 20th century history of China. And you read the way that the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution came about. They created the same exact incentive structure. Like the Great Leap Forward was not, we are going to keep people from eating, and that's why everybody starved. It was, no, we are going to create more than any other country on the planet has ever created. That was what they were trying to do. But they created the incentive structure that it created. Not only did not create more than the US or Russia was creating, but created so little that 30 million people ended up dying in famine. And then, when people say like, oh, well, this just hasn't been tried correctly yet, it's like, Chinese and Russians and Venezuelans and Cubans, they're all such different cultures, such different people, such different backgrounds. North Korea, they all devolve into the same exact thing. How does that happen? Every single time. And it's because we started the conversation with about my experience in China is we share so much in common, both our flaws and the positive aspects of humanity. And we really need to keep that in perspective, I think.
Well, so Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life,
mm-hmm.
I think it's either chapter 7 or chapter 8, is on truth. And the rule is speak the truth, at least don't lie. And he spends that entire chapter talking about the Soviet Union and China,
yeah.
and detailing what happened in both those nations, because people started keeping their mouths shut about what they saw. And he's warning us that we must not do that. We must speak. We must continue to speak, even though many times it's very frightening to speak into this world that we live in. So,
and I think on kind of a positive note is, like, it always looks like the worst time it's ever been. For everybody always feels that way, no matter what time period or perspective that they have. I think the fact of the matter is that we can speak these things, that there are people that are speaking these things, and even though there are consequences, the consequences are so much less bad than what you would have if you are in, old communist China or Soviet Russia or current Venezuela, that, the hope that we can get is that people are talking about it, and we now have mediums to discuss them. I think there's all this commotion about social media and blogs and fake news and all this sort of stuff, but it actually kind of reminds me of, if you look back to the founding era, like the free press was a mess. There was every bit of news was out there. There was a printing press in every corner, and it's kind of the equivalent of our blogs or podcasts today. And what it does is it creates an environment where you actually have to seek out the truth. You have to have a discerning mind. And I think we've gotten lazy over the past 100 years. This idea that a free press is, a press that only says the truth is wrong. A free press is just people. It's a freedom to discuss. We actually have that now. And I don't think that, as much as things may seem bad, we are in one of the best times in human history for communications and sharing ideas and discovering new ideas. If we can just get over the animosity. And again, even if you look back at the stuff that people would say about Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, it was horrible.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah. So, it is, again, humans don't change. We were the same 300, 500, 1,000 years ago in every single country. So it's all right.
So very, very good talking to you, Buck. I hope that we get another opportunity in the future. And would you send me any links that you think would be important for viewers to learn more about Bitcoin and also any of these other things that you've discussed? Maybe you have a favorite thing on the Constitution or on the Federalist Papers, or any books that you have. Just send me any links that you think might be good, and I'll put them in.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Okay, I'll send you this video. You can watch it and decide whether or not it's okay to publish.
Okay.
And as soon as you give me the go-ahead, I'll publish it.
All right. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Enjoy this.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.